Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm ABC 10 meteorologist Brendan Minchef. On this week's Climate Conversation, we return to the Delta. And who better to talk about the Delta than the man known as the Delta Watermaster? I'm joined on the program today by Jay Ziegler. You are the Delta Watermaster. That is possibly the most interesting title of anybody that we've spoken to so far. What is the Delta Watermaster?
Well, Brendan, thanks for having me. It really is the referee for water rights in the Delta. There are some 1,300 water rights holders scattered across this 5-county, 750,000 square mile region. We have mapped it all out, and our job is to ensure that as a Delta resident, you're taking the water that you have a right to, and that you're sharing that information openly, that you're reporting it out. And that we balance the interests of the state and federal water projects, which take water out of the southern part of the Delta. That's about 5 million acre feet a year. By comparison, the range of use in the Delta is probably about 1 million acre foot to 1.3 million acre feet on the outside, according to the best science that we can apply in terms of agricultural uses of water in the Delta. So the Delta Watermaster is assigned with the responsibility of making sure that people are playing by the rules of the water rights system and managing to achieve water quality goals, which in a year like this, a relatively wet year or above normal year in water year 24, this is what we're trying to do is really measure everybody's use, apply science to really get a unified understanding of what the actual Delta water budget is at any point in time when people are diverting water, when they're pumping water out of the system, when we need water for fish going out the Golden Gate Bridge. And so making sure all of those beneficial uses of water are met and that everybody's playing by the rules.
And the Delta Watermaster part of the state water boards, right? So you're kind of intertwined with them?
It is, in a sense, yes. It's an independent position that was created by the Delta Reform Act in 2009. That same act also created the Delta Stewardship Council, which develops the Delta Plan. And this position reports jointly to the State Water Board and the Delta Stewardship Council. And so that latter part, in aligning with the Delta Stewardship Council, is really a recognition that land use is intrinsically linked to water use. And so we need to be sure that what we're doing on the land side of it is compatible with how we're managing water resources and that we're all sharing information in the right way to better understand all those uses of water.
How did you get the Delta Watermaster job?
Yeah, that's a great question. I started my career back in the 1980s working with a then state senator, John Garamendi, now a congressman representing the Delta. And in some way, for just about all of my entire career, I've worked around the Delta. And so if you can go back to the summer of 22, my predecessor, Michael George, had announced that he was going to be leaving the position of the Delta Watermaster. He served 2 terms in that role. And so the position was going to come open. I had done some work with Michael in my job as the policy director at the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy runs a fair amount of land and restoration projects across the Delta. And so it's always been a part of my career. And I was very interested, and remember back to 22, we were at that time in year 3 of a drought. And if we'd gone to year 4, there really could have been incredible stress, not just in the Delta, but really for all water users, for all Californians for that matter. And I thought that this would be a place where I could really make a difference. And I feel one of the things in my career is that I've worked on the sustainability side from the environmental perspective, but we've also done a lot of work with water agencies throughout California. And I felt that that understanding the cultures of water agencies as well as the objectives of how we need to manage water to become more sustainable in California for future generations, that I thought I could make a difference in this job. So I applied for the job, and a number of months later, I was hired into the role in April of 2023. So I'm now in this position just about a year.
Thanks. We've spoken before, part of the Water Wasted series that we did about a year ago on ABC 10, and you've been very helpful in understanding the Delta. The Delta is, I would say, not well understood by a lot of folks. It's an area with a lot of nuance that goes on. Maybe this is a tough question to answer, but what is something about the Delta that folks don't know, but they should know?
Yeah, so that's a great question because I think, honestly, I feel like in this job I'm learning something every day, and the Delta is a very unique place. I think the one thing that is particularly important to think about is we often kind of look at, well, how much water is coming down the Sacramento River and ultimately out the San Joaquin River and into and the confluence of those rivers is the Delta. And so we think about the system just in terms of the freshwater input. And in the winter, that's, we may have 80,000 cubic feet per second roaring down the Sacramento River. And in not so much this year in 24, but in last year in those incredible storms and the snowpack in the San Joaquin, we were looking at flows out the San Joaquin River at the end of August of 20,000 cubic feet per second. And those are winter level flows and that we usually see. And they were lasting all into the summer. And so we often think just about, how much fresh water is coming into the Delta to keep it fresh, to protect water quality. What we really don't think about is that this is an estuary. It has a huge, open ocean confluence with the tides. And that tidal energy overwhelms the inflow of the freshwater river infusion from the San Joaquin and Sacramento in all but the winter months. And so the rest of the year, and even in the winter, it's an incredibly strong tidal system. And we've kind of forgotten that dynamic. For example, if we put a balsa wood marker at the mouth of Frank's Tract at the beginning of the ebb tide, that balsa wood marker would go 8 miles out toward the Golden Gate Bridge. And then when the tide would start to come back in, it would come back to us 8 miles. That's just to wrap your head around the strength of that tidal energy is just a dynamic that I think even among those of us that are paying attention to the Delta all the time, that dynamic is just incredibly important. It's a very unique tidal system. It is the most productive estuary on the entire west coast of the Americas. So from the tip of Chile to the Arctic Circle, our estuary has just very unique values, and that's the reason it's been such a productive estuarian system for salmon. That are, essentially our fall run provides salmon that are caught all the way to Canada and all along the western coast in an average year. Now this year the season is closed because we're still recovering from drought dynamics in 2020, 2021, 2022. But this is an incredibly productive estuary, and so we know the system is entirely connected to San Francisco Bay and the ocean, but we forget about that sometimes, and we just think about, well, what is the freshwater environment here, and it's infinitely more complex than that.
Because the saltwater input is just as important, right? Like you talked about with the salmon.
Exactly. So how we manage for water quality objectives, because we all know, well, things don't grow in salt water.
Sure.
And so there's some aquatic plants, of course, that do, and fish do all right in salt water, but it doesn't do well. It's not a good agricultural source for water. So we have to manage the Delta to control salinity. But doing that in what is overwhelmingly a tidal system, I think requires more creativity than we've heretofore applied to Delta management actions, whether it's water quality objectives or conservation of endangered salmon and Delta smelt. And so I think we need to focus more on the intersection of the freshwater and tidal dynamics in the system and think about restoration opportunities more creatively. What could we do a little differently at Frank's Tract that might, which is a big open water, it appears that if you look at it on a map, it looks like a big lake in the middle of the Delta. And it was an island that was flooded back in the 70s, 80s, and has been left to open water, and and that's not really good. It's not good for water quality. It's in what is a highly altered system. Like imagine the whole Delta used to be a big marsh, and it's also a very young geologically speaking, as a water body. I mean, you've got Lake Tahoe and the Sierra. It's 2 million years old as a water body. The delta is 40,000 years old, and it was formed by not a traditional delta the way we think of the Mississippi River, sort of pushing all that sediment out and forming land. It was formed when the glaciers were retreating, and there was incredible snow melt and pushing all the sediment out to the mouth of the Carquinez Straits, and formed a dam that created a giant inland lake in the Central Valley. And then ultimately the dam broke again. And then when the gold rush came, all of these 56 odd major islands in the Delta were reclaimed, diked, levied up. And so now we have this configured water body with 1,100 square miles of levees that is anything but a natural system, but it's what we have come to realize and manage and treat as the Delta since the 1850s. And so that is, that's the history, and it's tricky and complicated, and provides real challenges in terms of aligning existing land uses and land purposes around the Delta with some of the real climate threats that we encounter, and especially in high flow winters that really threaten these islands, which when we think of islands usually are up above the water. The islands in the Delta are below the water. We should call them sinks more than we call them islands. But those are the kinds of things that we do need to be thinking about in living in a climate changing world with accelerating threats that brings in different stripes.
And there's a statistic that about a third of the ag land in the Delta is 3 or more feet below sea level, which you touched on, which obviously makes the region very vulnerable to climate change, both from rising sea levels, but also from extreme precipitation events when maybe those levees are tested to their max.
Yeah.
But you recently started a new data collection effort in the Delta, because you've kind of been touching on it. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Tell me about that new data collection method.
Yeah. So it's really important because I think we have argued traditionally about how much water is getting taken out of the Delta before it gets to the pumps for the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. And what we have tried to do is, how do we get everybody together? How do we get the state and federal projects together with Delta farmers, with communities in the Delta, with the best scientists that we have? And what we've learned really, and thanks for your reporting in this space, because the use of new technology, so telemetry data from satellites, both to measure elevations of water down to the millimeter level, as well as evaporation of the water as it just evaporates into the atmosphere, and transpiration as it's absorbed by plants, can help us then back into, well, how much water are we actually using in the Delta? So we're using this a system called OpenET, studying the evapotranspiration in the Delta. And so we look at, what that tells us is how much water are we actually consuming in applied water for agriculture or any open landscape. It can be riparian land, open water in the Delta. And so the technology has moved so far, and this OpenET platform is actually the largest data subscriber on Google Earth. So I'm sure we're all using Google Earth, so that's a reference point. But the data is so detailed, and it gives us a real opportunity to actually then understand an actual diversion point aligned with a place of where that water is used, and how much water is getting used on that cornfield in 50 acres, or how much water is getting used on a riparian restoration project on 100 acres. And to really be able to align for almost 3,000 points of diversion across the Delta. We have the first data set. It's www.deltaacp.com is the website to really, if you're curious about, hey, I wonder how much water the Nature Conservancy is using at Staten Island, you can find out right there. And you can also see where the point of diversion is bringing water onto the land and how much they're using. And so we're using this telemetry-based approach to better understand consumptive use in the Delta. And The technology is moving so fast that I think if we were sitting here 2 years from now, we'd be able to actually pull up an app on our phone and say, okay, how much water is being used on WebTract or any other island around the Delta, and have a level of confidence that we know exactly how much water is going through the system. That helps us better understand how we keep the water fresh for people, for agriculture, for fish that are depending on fresh water, and just putting the full picture together of understanding that you're following the rules of your water rights, I'm following the rules of my water rights, and the data is fully transparent to everybody. And I think that's where we need to get. The state board is now working on a statewide data modernization system. That's going to tell us a lot more statewide. We're a little bit ahead of the curve on that. So by applying this remote sensing based architecture for water use reporting, we're going to get better data faster and really understand this the actual consumptive use in real time in the Delta. So that's what I'm really excited about that. We have a consortium of all comers, so people from NASA to Delta farmers, water attorneys, academics that really kind of help us define a body of experiments that we continue to work on to true up the water budget in the Delta and be able to share that with folks and wherever you may be sitting so that you can understand, okay, I want to see real science. I want to understand the real hydrodynamics of the Delta in August of 2024 rather than just hypothetically at any point in time in the past. And so that's what we need to get to. And I'm excited about that. I think we've got a great buy-in. The Central and South Delta water agencies were really pioneers in moving this technology forward. And a part of why I think that's so important is that you need to meet water users where they're at and make sure they're comfortable with the system or they're not going to buy into it. And so we've been able to kind of really achieve a kind of a cultural shift among the 1,300 water users across the Delta to be more forthcoming about water use and to share that more openly. And so and the alternative to that, this is really driven by legislation that was adopted just around the drought in 2015. It was Senate Bill 88 that required all major water diverters to report their water use. So anybody who uses more than 5 acre-foot is legally required to report their water usage. And we tried to do that when I was at the Nature Conservancy. We wanted to be a first adopter. And we tried about a half dozen different siphon gauge technologies because most of the Delta works off of siphon pumps. So you get the pump primed and it's putting water onto your land. And it turns out that there's just a lot of detritus, there's a lot of changed conditions in the Delta, and that metered data just didn't work. It was highly unreliable and super expensive. So as I talked about, if we wanted to have everybody have a siphon on their gauge, and there's a reason why that doesn't really work well technically, I can get into as well, but if we required everybody to have a siphon on their pumps, there are almost 3,000 points of diversion, and projections are that each one of those siphon gauges costs $10,000 to $20,000 to operate. So you're looking at a $30 to $60 million project if you were to legally prescribe everybody's got to have a siphon. We have to have gauge data because that's what the law says. The law also provides for alternative compliance programs if you can get better data, if it's more cost feasible, and you have a better buy-in to the system. And that's exactly what we've achieved, largely through the work of my predecessor. But we've just gotten that system online in the last year for actual water data reporting. But it's pretty exciting, for geeks like me that are wanting to be able to share in an open way what the data is telling us. And then if we can all agree on the data, then we can have a better conversation about how we should be managing the resource. So that's what I'm really aiming to get to in the Watermaster role in the Delta.
I do want to ask, though, how did you get so much buy-in? Were people ready to engage? Were farmers coming to you and saying, yeah, we want to prove that we're not wasting water? Or did it take kind of a messaging campaign?
Well, it's, again, let's go back to drought number one. So water year, go all the way back to 2012 and through 2016. And people were increasingly worried about losing control of the Delta, which would which essentially means that it becomes an inland sea. And that if you don't have freshwater input at all, you're looking at an incredibly salty environment. And so out of that backdrop, and everybody, you remember in those moments, all agriculture is getting curtailed, water use is being strictly watched by communities across the state. Everybody's establishing conservation targets. So my predecessors established a 25% target across the Delta and got some on a voluntary basis. And a part of that is that in California, as our first in time, first in right water system principles for water rights really drives a need to think about, okay, I can't just do randomly apply a methodology that reduces water use. I also have to recognize those most senior rights. And those most senior rights also exist throughout the Delta. So, which I think is fair because you're also at the confluence of the system. You're at the confluence of the state and federal project interests. And so I think it's necessarily complex, even as I'd love for that dynamic to be easier from one day to the next. But the reality is, it's just, we need to have a better buy-in to that. So out of that drought experience, I think the Delta farmers realized we need a system that is actually authoritatively providing better information of our actual diversions and water use, and in particular, how much water is getting consumed in the Delta in a wet year versus a dry year. And as you can imagine, in a wet year like we're in, it's less contentious. In a dry year, it's hugely contentious. And we just need to have the best information that we can for all stakeholders to make the right kinds of decisions so that we can make trade-offs in water management. And so I think, again, I give credit to the Central and South Delta water agencies because they were really driving this and working actively with my predecessor, Michael George, to really work hard on this knotty problem of how do we develop the system. Now, this didn't happen overnight. This project started in 2016 and formally in 2017. And so then, it took all of that time, and it's really just water year 22 that we've had this form of telemetry-based reporting just in place for just the last 2 water years. And so it takes a long time. It takes, but if I'm optimistic about one thing in water, technology can lead us to make better decisions in using the information. And so I think what we've achieved in the Delta is based on a recognition that none of the other metrics for measuring water would work. But if we went to an open ET system, ultimately we're going to get better information to make better decisions and have a better understanding about the trade-offs that we're making in water management.
And I want to ask too, you kind of touched on it before, climate change is really impacting not just the Delta, but obviously all across California and the globe, but specifically in the Delta for the wildlife that's there, for the ecosystem, for the people that call it home. What are maybe one or two of the biggest impacts that you're noticing ongoing in the Delta?
Wow. Well, that's a great question, because I would actually argue that the Delta is probably the most climate-threatened place in the United States. That it is, especially in winter, in the big flows where you can see our bypass full of 1 million acre-feet of water. The Sacramento River may be running at 100,000 CFS, and and you look and you're standing on some of these levees and you may have a foot or two of freeboard and a whole lot of seepage filling up your islands. And so in winter we acutely see the challenges of our changing climate conditions. And this flashier these storms become, I think the more cognizant everyone is of those challenges. And I think that what that really calls on is to protect the values that are in the Delta today. And let's also remember that the Delta is a national heritage area established by an act of Congress, recognizing the unique cultural values as well as the agricultural values and the 500,000 people that call the Delta home. It's an incredible resource, and effectively that federal charter and what we've seen in California policy over the years really means, how do we manage this system to better achieve ecological goals? And the Delta Reform Act, adopted in 2009, actually outlines two dual goals that are incredibly hard to align. One is to improve reliability for water supply, and that includes the state and federal projects. And the second is to improve ecological conditions in the Delta. So those are that frames up, A plus B does not equal C debates that we have had from the last 100 years, really, around Delta issues, and really center us on how do we manage this more sustainably? Well, in the near term, that means we need more money for levees. We need more technology to better monitor threats to levees from high water events. We need to use technology proactively to make sure we're applying the best information systems to keep people out of harm's way when the water is really high in the Delta. And at the same time, 100 years from now, we know the Delta is going to change. It won't look the way it does. Sea level rise is a coming phenomena that we're really going to have to wrestle with. But I think for the foreseeable future, we need significantly better investment in levees and the ability to preserve the infrastructure of these islands and an incredibly productive agricultural place in California, and just an incredibly accessible recreational resource for the 5-county Delta region. And Sacramento is kind of at the northeastern hub of all of that, and Stockton sits at the southeastern hub, and but it runs all the way out to Antioch and Contra Costa County at the same time. And so it's just, there are so many unique environments, and it's hard for me to look at the Delta as a monolith. I look at the opportunities for restoration in the north central Delta, where much of the land is still in these kind of dendritic channels, and that was very much like the original Delta before the pre-settlement era of the 1850 forward. And so there's a lot we can do for natural ecosystem restoration there. In Suisun Marsh, we can improve water quality conditions. We need to think constantly about the balance of freshwater wetland habitat and intertidal habitat that may be able to absorb higher sea level as well as stronger tides. And then in the western Delta, we need more floodplain to absorb the Casumnas energy, and so we don't have flooding in Wilton like we did in 2023. And so we need creative approaches that are targeted a little differently and look a little different in different areas of the Delta. I mean, one of the biggest ongoing concerns, and you've reported on this, is really harmful algal blooms in the southern Delta in particular, and what that means for San Joaquin County and Contra Costa County. And that's in many ways a water circulation issue, and we see a lot of impairments and sedimentation in the southern Delta. And we need an active dredging program in places like Middle River to help achieve water quality goals in the South Delta, which benefit both South Delta diverters as well as the state and federal water projects. So I think we need to think about what issues are we managing to address in different areas of the Delta and really get focused in that way.
And I do want to ask about the tunnel. The Delta Tunnel has been presented as a solution not just for the Delta and its communities, but also for water transport down to Southern California. We can't really speak about the Delta without mentioning this highly controversial project.
No, I appreciate that. So in my role as the Delta Watermaster, I'm in the midst of a regulatory process to evaluate the application that the State Water Project has submitted to the State Water Board. So I can't really speak directly to the tunnel, but what I can say is, as we think about a tunnel or any form of conveyance, what we really need to think about is, how is that project going to affect Delta water quality and the beneficial uses of water for the environment, for people, for agriculture, for all the purposes that we use water for. and apply a screen and looking at, okay, how would a project affect the beneficial uses of water in the Delta? And just so, if you will, I think we need to develop kind of a report card and evaluate, is the tunnel ultimately good, or is it bad for the Delta? And so I think that, that's the kind of evaluation process that we need to undertake. But that's what we'll be looking at over the next couple years in evaluating the application for that project, at least through the lens of the Office of the Delta Watermaster.
And ultimately, no matter what happens, the Delta Tunnel would still be a decade or two, down the road, right? Like, this is something we're going to turn on in 4 years.
I think you're raising a really important issue. That this is not a finger snap project. This is a 20-year complex infrastructure project, and so 20 years. We've just talked about 2 droughts over the last decade, 2 multi-year droughts in the last decade. We've got some real challenges to manage in thinking about how do we improve ecosystem objectives consistent with the Delta Reform Act? How do we improve water supply reliability with existing infrastructure in mind? How do we meet new threats like harmful algal blooms and which are toxic and lethal? And so we've got new threats that 10 years ago we didn't really even recognize that are going to affect all interests in the Delta, and those. So we need to work beyond whatever the long-term deal is on a conveyance project of any sort, whether it's this tunnel project or something thereafter. We really need an investment in better science to really, so that you and I could be sitting here looking at our dashboard of, Jay, what do these water quality metrics mean for Delta operations today? Fortunately, I would tell you today we're in great shape. We're meeting all of our water quality objectives throughout the Delta, but we've had an above normal water year. And so I think we need to recognize that we need to improve the ecosystem functions. We need to have a better monitoring network to understand harmful algal blooms and threats and other threats to water quality. And we need immediate investment in levees to really help kind of ensure the viability of these islands in high water events in the winter. And so there's just so much, Brendan, that we need to be thinking about right now and collaborating on with all water users, whether they're in Southern California or the San Francisco Bay or wherever those water users are, and really kind of come together around those difficult to achieve but central values of the Delta Reform Act of managing this place to achieve more reliable water supply and at the same time make it improve the ecological conditions and recognize the needs of the 500,000 people that live in and around the Delta region. And so, so there's no panacea here. There's this is a long challenge that, and we need to use our tools and especially I think in science, bringing people together around information that you don't have your data and I have my data, and then we take it to court and we argue whose is better. We need more transparent, really best level science, and that's again why I'm so excited about applying this OpenET methodology to better understand the Delta water budget in real time and how much water is getting pulled out at any particular time. And so I think, we've got to have better science, better applied science, so that we are all talking about the same data, and then we can have an honest conversation about the trade-offs we're making in water management decisions.
And lastly, I want to ask you, you kind of covered what the future looks like, but what gives you hope going forward as you look at the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years? I mean, what doesn't keep you up at night? What do you feel good about on the horizon?
I think what gives me the most hope in approaching this job and in just thinking about Delta stewardship more generally is that I do believe we are communicating better about these values, and I also believe that through the use of satellites, on the ground telemetry stations to monitor for carbon and water use and soil moisture, to be able to use satellite data to evaluate land slippage in very, down to the millimeter. I mean, it's just amazing what the satellite information can pick up for applied management in the Delta. I think what gives me the most hope is we've got a better dialogue and higher level of confidence, and just thinking about these 1,300 water rights holders across 750,000 square miles. We're all buying into the same dashboard and what it's telling us about water use in the Delta. And I think as we tear off of that, we get better information about elevations of water levels and what those mean for water quality and for getting water to the pumps, and for ensuring that the water rights in the Delta can be exercised fairly as well. I think what gives me the most hope is we're getting a dialogue, we're getting buy-in, we have better tools. And so now it's incumbent on all the agencies, state, federal, local, to really come together. And whether your concern is flood risk, whether it's water availability, whether it's habitat, whether it's water quality, that we're all just able to share this data more openly and have better conversations about how we manage to achieve certain goals, so that we're not just fighting. So Brendan doesn't have his science deck and Jay has his science deck, and we take them to court and argue, because that's kind of the traditional path, unfortunately, that we've seen in a lot of disputes, is that candidly our parameters for water management have often been set by the courts. And I think that the pace of science, the adoption level, and the buy-in to that science is really critical. Now, I think that does require more state and federal investment in science to get us there faster. And so I think we all have to embrace that path. And so then, we can take the same data and have a better conversation about what trade-offs are we making for water supply versus habitat versus water quality, and putting all of that information together. And I think that's, so that's what gives me hope. I mean, I think that we're seeing a real buy-in to applied technology and the use of telemetry data, the use of satellite data, and the critical factor of gauging throughout the system that tells us real-time conditions for temperature, turbidity, and water quality too. And so just putting those tools together, I feel like we are on a path to make better decisions in water management, and we just have to we need to develop that toolkit as fast as we can. I think recognizing, as you're pointing out, the climate threats of longer droughts and bigger super surge winters like we saw last year in 2023.
Jay, thank you so much for being here. Always a great time talking to you.
Brendan, you're great. Thank you for keeping your eyes on the challenges of climate change throughout California. I appreciate your attention to these issues. I think it's really helping us get to that importance of understanding applied science and in making better natural resource management decisions.
We do our best.
There you go.
Thank you so much.
All right.